A home race of 3.5 drivers on the grid, the British GP is not only rich in history, in all types of weather conditions, in local celebrities, it has also been one of the most action-packed weekends this year, with strategical blunders and masterpieces, and of course with featuring Brad Pitt himself. With so much to dissect, let's just jump straight in. Heading into the weekend, we received the news of Ollie Behrman's multi-year contract deal with Haas, which wasn't very shocking, but certainly was heartwarming, and rumors started to swirl about Perez's potential replacement, who would be none other than Ricciardo. What is interesting about this story is that this was reported by a quite credible news outlet. Was Ricciardo's track performance this year convincing enough? I'm not sure, but it seems like he's the favorite for that seat. Silverstone has always been a high-speed circuit, and therefore, the hardest compounds are allocated to this weekend. That was C1, C2, and C3. Because a lot of teams' factories are located nearby, it is common for them to bring in most of their upgrade packages to Silverstone. First and foremost, this circuit requires quite a delicate balance between downforce and straight line speed. And to meet all the requirements, McLaren and Mercedes both brought in lower downforce wings, which Mercedes compensated with changing their front wings slightly, and McLaren brought in 3 types of beam wings, and in the end they ended up choosing the highest downforce beam wing to compensate for all the downforce that they lose in the rear wing. Aside from them, Aston Martin brought in new front wings, which seemed to be working pretty well, and it was Haas to bring in the most upgrades, but to be frank, most of these changes were consequential of 2 major modifications, and that was the floor body change and the side pod inlet. We know that Haas has been really good in the straight line, much like last year's Williams, but now they are focusing on creating a more rounded car, and based on the results this weekend, they are on a very good path. It was RB who decided to get rid of those halo winglets because their upgrades clearly were not working very well. Onto the senior team, they have changed their floor body and floor edge to gain some aero advantages. Whether that worked or not is really hard to tell because of that mistake that verstappen made in Q1, and well, why talk about Perez at all at this point? And about Ferrari, they haven't brought in any new packages. However, they wanted to understand which spec works best for them. And therefore, during the first free practice, we saw Sainz running with the Imola spec and Leclerc running with the Spain upgrades. And that leads me to the free practice sessions. As I mentioned, Leclerc was running the Spain spec and he was struggling in high speed. He was bouncing a lot and he couldn't even get to 8th gear. It's safe to say that the Spain upgrades proved to be really complicated at best and barely functioning at worst. But that was really just the first droplet in the ocean of Leclerc pain. The first free practice saw 4 F2 drivers trying their luck, and a notable thing was Hajar's impeding ahead of Norris, for which he was fined by $25,000, a very hefty check to pick up by Red Bull, I'm sure. Stroll was also fined for impeding by $15,000, but I'm sure that did not break the bank. A few notable things were Aston Martin's decent pace. Hulk looked great. So did Williams, at least relatively to their performance on prior weekends. Since we had 2 dry sessions, FP1 and FP2, in FP2 most of the drivers were trying either mediums or softs for long runs, and Norris and Verstappen seemed really good on mediums, whilst Russell was setting consistent lap times on softs. And remember that, because it's gonna be an important factor for the race as well. But before we get to the race, there are loads of things to talk about in relation to the quali session. In Q1, everybody started on inters, but then the track started to dry up, and it was Bottas who pitted first for softs, which was a smart decision. Perez was also one of the earliest ones to go for softs. But once Prix put the softs on, unfortunately, he had that slide into turn 9. He then ended up in the gravel, and that was it for his quali session completely. But surely, you would say, he was at least setting good times on the intermediates? No, he was not. This wasn't the only Red Bull mistake during the session, though. There was this brief moment with some light drizzle, which then resulted Verstappen sliding and damaging his floor quite extensively with that gravel contact, and that influenced his session as a whole, unfortunately. But it was not only him who lost out on that drizzle, but in a different way. So Magnussen thought that a heavier rain was coming, he remained in the pits, and therefore he was out. that was not a right call for sure, as almost all components were changed on Gasly's PU. He didn't even go out on softs. There was this thing with Ocon who thought that he did not reach the checkered flag because the team told him that he did not, but at the end of the day he could have set a lap, and Bottas just couldn't improve on his lap, which is unfortunate because he was the first one to really demonstrate that the softs worked. In Q2, the Leclerc pain continued. He lost some time in sector 2 and sector 3, which then put him in 11th place. One notable thing, which I didn't highlight before, but both Williams drivers were through Q1. Sargent could not continue into Q3, but he still finished 12th, which is a very good job on a 4th of July weekend, especially. Both RBs were out. Ricciardo was definitely unfortunate with that traffic on his outlap. He had to overtake a bunch of cars. Tsunoda was not quick enough to get out of Q2 either. And the remaining Sauber of Joes was also too slow at the end of the day. We had a very exciting Q3, Verstappen with that damage, McLaren looking strong, Mercedes looking really good. Piastri was unfortunate during this quali session. He was running in one pack with Sainz and Alonso. Alonso actually had to back out. They were pushing way too hard on their outlap, by the way. They had to rush to reach the checkered flag, which they barely did. With the Alonso backing out, that meant that he couldn't finish his fast lap. He was trying to overtake Sainz at one point, but then Piastri went by. He was heavily compromised, and Piastri was to some extent. He was running behind Sainz the whole time. With that damage, Verstappen made a mistake in the first sector, and although he was making up time in the following sectors, that unfortunately wasn't enough for him to position him anywhere above 4th. It was surprising to me at the end of the day that Norris could not beat any of the Mercedes drivers, and also the gap between Russell and Hamilton was quite substantial. It was 1.7 tenths, which, don't get me wrong, it's not a lot. However, the usual gap between them is much smaller, so in that context, it's actually not negligible. Commendable pace again from Hülkenberg, who was the fastest Ferrari out there. Not only that, but he was 1.7 tenths faster than Sainz and only about a tenth behind Piastri. At the end of the day, the British dream came true, with Russell setting the fastest lap time, followed by Hamilton and then Norris. But let's praise Alex Albon too, who not only reached Q3 but also finished 9th. We knew that the race was going to be something exceptional, and oh boy, did it deliver. Already before lights out, Gasly had a gearbox issue on his formation lap, so with all that changes on his car, he couldn't even race one lap. Very unfortunate for Alpine, not only for Gasly but for Ocon. The whole weekend is just something to forget for the team. On the first lap, Albon and Hülkenberg fell a bit behind. Albon got squeezed. He had a bit of a wing damage, which fortunately could be amended by the team later on during the race, but this damage definitely did not help him in his first stint. Of course, I have to mention Leclerc, who was heroically climbing up. He was actually behind Sainz. It was looking like a great recovery drive from what happened during quali, but alas, things happened later on. Verstappen had an amazing start overtaking Norris, but then his tire drag was a lot more significant to McLaren and Mercedes. On average, he lost 3 to 4 tenths, but it was really ranging from no disadvantage at the beginning to 8 tenths, almost a second, towards the end of that medium stint. The drizzle that came between lap 16 and 19 saw the McLarens charging through the field. Both Piastri and Norris were insanely quick, especially Piastri. The overtakes he demonstrated on Russell and Hamilton was something else. The confidence he had in that car was amazing, and he was in Norris's DRS range all throughout up until that pit stop that they made that I have to talk about, of course. After lap 19, a few teams decided to put their drivers on inters, which was definitely the worst decision possible. I think Perez was kind of a test case for Verstappen, so that was the reason for his pit stop, but Ocon and Zhou also went out, and of course, I have to talk about Leclerc. Leclerc lost about 10 seconds on average per lap compared to Sainz during the time he had those inters on. Strategical blunder at its peak. That wasn't the only strategical blunder during the race, because around lap 26, a lot of teams realized that this was the time to go for intermediates. Hülkenberg, Sainz, Verstappen all went out after 26 laps, while some teams like Williams, Mercedes, and McLaren decided to stay out. After 27 laps, a few teams had to double stack given that both of their drivers were still out on slicks. So Williams double stacked, Mercedes did too, and it should have been the case for McLaren too. Instead, they left Piastri out there for another complete lap where he lost about 20 seconds, which is a full pit stop worth time, to then call him into the pits way too late, and that essentially cost him a potential win. So Alonso was living his best life in the rainy conditions on slicks. And I mentioned this, that a lot of teams realized that after 26 laps they had to pit one of their drivers, and Aston Martin did that, but they called in Stroll, who was behind Alonso. But because Stroll was the one to be put on intermediates first, that meant that he gained a few seconds, I think around 6 seconds, on Alonso, who went into the pits a lap later. Now you could ask the question, what about all those early Inter drivers? Did they gain an advantage now that they were out on Inters for such a long time and everybody else had to go into the pits? No, they did not, because the tire degradation during that time that they had those Inters on and others were running on slicks, that was huge for them, which meant that they had to go back to the pits and change for a new set of Inters. Best strategy ever. Of course, I have to mention that middle Inter stint for Verstappen versus everybody else, because he was substantially slower again than Norris or the Mercedes drivers. That was until the end of the Inter stint, because what I suspect happened, his tire degradation on the Inters converted those tires into slicks a little bit, and when that changing point came between Inters and mediums, he was a lot faster than both Norris and Hamilton. Sadly, during that intermediate run, pole sitter George Russell had a reliability issue. He had to retire his car. Because of the double stack, by the way, with Mercedes, he already lost a position to Verstappen. So that's a real blow for him, especially given the fact that he started from pole. Of course, this all wasn't the end of the McLaren bad strategy coal saga. Red Bull once again knew when to pit. They also knew what to pit for. Hamilton got new tires the same time as Verstappen did. However, Hamilton went for softs while Verstappen went for hards. For whatever reason, McLaren thought, you know what, we can keep Norris a lap longer out there. The problem was that he was losing a lot of time, I think a few seconds to Max at that point. And once Norris came into the pits, he didn't position his car appropriately, which meant that he had a longer pit stop as well. And he received the same tires essentially as Hamilton did, which wasn't the right call. The reason why the softs were not the right call is that they were degrading a lot. They didn't provide any advantages at the beginning compared to Verstappen's hards, and at the end Norris ended up a second slower than Max, who was about 0.4, half a second quicker than Hamilton. This is when I need to refer back to what I said about FP2 and Russell's tire dag being really reliable on those softs. We saw that with Hamilton, much better tire dag than McLaren, which absolutely helped him at the end, although he had to manage those tires beautifully, which he did, so Verstappen couldn't reach him, and he had a mighty emotional win at the end, taking that trophy for the British GP. Norris and Hamilton were not the only ones to go for soft compounds, as we saw Tsunoda, the Haas drivers, all going for the C3 tires at the end. The problem was, for instance, in the case of Tsunoda, that Albon went for mediums and he overtook Tsunoda at the end, and that's how he grabbed 9th position. Naturally, I have to mention Piastri was about as fast as Verstappen on those mediums, if not a bit faster at times. He was just fluctuating slightly more. He finished about 12 seconds behind Hamilton. He lost 20 with that bad strategy call. Safe to say, he could have won this GP. But as we can see, McLaren may have the fastest car right now, but they need to get their strategy calls in order. Funnily enough, even though Max was struggling throughout the whole weekend, he still extended his lead ahead of Norris in the championship. That's a wake-up call for McLaren. As I mentioned, Hülkenberg and Magnussen went for softs, both of them did, but Hülkenberg was much faster than Magnussen. That is why I have to commend that man. He was quick in qualifying, quick in the race, absolutely unbeatable. Haas's directions are perfect this time around. Their upgrades are actually not downgrades like we see in the case of Aston Martin, RB, Ferrari. They are on a very good trajectory at the moment. What are the conclusions after this weekend? So many things have happened. It's astonishing to me how Red Bull ended up losing all that advantage ahead of everybody else. McLaren are faster. Yes, we know that. But now, maybe Mercedes too. Ferrari are struggling at the moment. It may be that Leclerc had to sell his soul to get that Monaco win, and now he's just gonna be unfortunate for the rest of the season. But you see him in interviews, and that man is destroyed. I really feel for him. He's one of the most talented drivers on the grid, but lately he has made a few mistakes. Ferrari has not made the right strategy calls, of course, and that altogether demolishes this man's chances on every single GP. Alpine may have lost momentum. They started really strong into this triple header, but Ocon had a terrible race. Gasly didn't even have a race. I hope that they climb back. Otherwise, this was a disastrous weekend for them. Haas are now only 4 points away from RB. Hülkenberg has been putting in spectacular performances. Magnussen is trying too, don't get me wrong. Of course, his chances were highly influenced by that bad call during the quali session. He still gained a few positions. So I think that the force is with Haas right now. One thing that stood out to me is how Norris blames himself every single time something goes wrong. And to be honest, he should not be the person judging whether the soft is better than the mediums at the end. I know that drivers are sometimes better in judging when to go from inters to slicks. However, the difference between the compounds, that should be monitored by the team. All the data collected through the 3 free practices is there for them to judge whether it should be mediums or softs. It wasn't only Norris who made that mistake, right? We saw different teams as well going for softs, and that was not the right choice at the end. But Norris taking that blame fully and him looking like he's absolutely destroyed, I don't think that's warranted. By the way, did you see that behind a very disappointed Lando Norris, there was a Brett Pitt giving his fake interview? I mean, that was a bit over the top for me. And finally, my driver of the day, or rather driver of the weekend, I have to choose Hülkenberg again. His pace was absolutely fantastic in quali and perfection in the race. I have to commend Hamilton, of course, as well. The only reason why I'd say he's not the driver of my day is because of that gap that he had behind Russell during quali. But other than that, his race was absolutely perfect. And now, as you can see on the point distribution table, McLaren backed the most points, but that's thanks to Russell's reliability issue. And of course, Perez was out of the game completely. But so far, even with the upgrades, Verstappen doesn't seem the quickest at all. He has a really big gap in the championship, so it is difficult to beat him, I think. But if McLaren continue to lose out on points because of these bad calls, it's going to be even more difficult to get near Max because he doesn't make a lot of mistakes. And of course, Red Bull as a team, they also very rarely do. But that is it from my side. Please let me know what you thought of this weekend in the comment section below. Otherwise, see you after Hungary.